Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond. This is my channel where I look at the adventures of fictional super spy James Bond 007 and dig for what lies just beneath the surface. Today we are talking about The World Is Not Enough in part 3 of my 4-part series on the Pierce Brosnan James Bond films. The World Is Not Enough feels to me like the first Pierce Brosnan Bond film that doesn't have something to prove. GoldenEye came out, guns blazing, working overtime to establish Bond as being a relevant figure in the landscape of the 1990s, and also working overtime to establish Pierce Brosnan as this iconic, glamorous version of James Bond, this sort of idealized James Bond for the 1990s. And you see that again in Tomorrow Never Dies to a certain extent. Brosnan's certainly more at home in the character, but you're also feeling the movie leaning forward to make sure that you are getting an overdose of that Bondian glamour, especially in the way that the character is presented. And for both films, there seems to be an emphasis on establishing Bond as a credible action hero in the landscapes of the 1990s. The World Is Not Enough, conversely, feels to me a lot more in line with the Bond films of the 1980s. In many ways, this feels like it seamlessly extends from the John Glenn films of that period. Its forebear, in many ways, is For Your Eyes Only. Aesthetically, tonally, For Your Eyes Only even mentions the mythical character Elektra. That name appears here in The World Is Not Enough and describes what is, in my opinion, the best villain of the Brosnan run. And so you get that sort of kinship there. There is a sort of relaxed feeling about The World Is Not Enough. Potentially too relaxed in some places. I think the action in this film is some of the weaker action of the Pierce Brosnan run, outside of the wonderful pre-title sequence. It's a little slack, a little loose, but I think altogether this film has one of the stronger plot lines of the Brosnan era, and it feels very consistent with the traditional Bond film canon, and I personally respond to that a great deal. It is carrying forward this idea that this Brosnan Bond, is uniquely tied to the changeover in time period in history. The World Is Not Enough, more so than any other Brosnan Bond film besides GoldenEye, is very preoccupied with this idea of what is happening in the aftermath of the Soviet Union. Very focused on, the arms trading behind the scenes, what is being driven there, the leftovers of the ramifications of nuclear proliferation and the threat that poses to the world. That's very much the forefront of The World Is Not Enough's mind. And added into that, you have a slight awareness of the changing of decades here. This is a Bond film that sits right at the changeover for the new millennium. It doesn't drive the story in a significant way, but it does provide some window dressing, and it also provides a closing joke for the film. In this way, Pierce Brosnan is a Bond that straddles three decades, right? He's introduced as a Bond that is straddling the 1980s and the 1990s in GoldenEye, and now he's poised to enter the new millennium. And we'll see what it means for Bond to exist in the new millennium once we get to Die Another Day. But that's an interesting facet that has been consistent across this run. Again, the sense of Bond being a character that exists in this sort of geopolitical history, that's very unique to Brosnan's Bond, to the extent that these movies keep emphasizing that. Bond in this film is slightly shifted in emphasis from what we've seen in the prior two films. Brosnan's Bond I've previously described as being the valiant White Knight, as Tomorrow Never Dies refers to him via his code name. He is the righteous soldier in some ways. And in this movie, we get a strong emphasis on that element. We get a strong emphasis on Bond's sensitive side, the sensitivity that Brosnan has brought to the character, this sort of open emotional accessibility and vulnerability. The movie leans into that to an extreme point. I think Bond has never been quite as tender and emotionally accessible and sensitive as he is in this movie. He hasn't been since. As much as the Craig Bond films lean into melodrama and lean into, trauma and emotional turmoil, this sort of constant emotional accessibility for Bond is very unique to this incarnation of Bond, and in particular this film. That is not a common feature for Craig's Bond, who is very emotionally reserved, very internalized. Brosnan's Bond, everything lives on the surface. And that's emphasized in this movie because we've shifted away from emphasizing the sort of Bond, the icon. The glamour is a little bit more toned down here. Brosnan's attire is a little bit more subtle. His manner is a little bit more relaxed. You still get movie star moments. This is still a Bond who straightens his tie underwater. And the comedy has started to shift in the direction of a little bit more Roger Moore playfulness and goofiness, but with a sort of crassness that is relatively consistent in the Brosnan era. A good example of that is the Moneypenny Bond relationship. There is a sort of shift from the sort of cute, light, quasi-romantic banter of the Moneypenny Bond interactions in prior incarnations. And here, there's a sort of semi-hostile lust between the two of them, and the banter between them is explicit and kind of crass in a way that is, in retrospect, kind of shocking. It seems to be a response from the shift to the 90s of Moneypenny and Bond are introduced in GoldenEye, obviously tangling over, sexual harassment and office workplace politics. And in some ways, the subsequent films seem to address that by just leaning hard in the direction of their flirtation being as brazen as possible. The World Is Not Enough definitely picks up on that with the joke about the cigar. But there is this sort of very wonderful comfort level that Brosnan has in this film. He's very settled in the role. He's introduced early on in the pre-title sequence in a way that is once again reinforcing this idea of this Bond as being the businessman Bond. This Bond is a guy who is able to enter the corridors of international business, kind of go in and perform his duty as a licensed troubleshooter, so to speak, and clean things up. And you see that in this opening sequence where he's dealing with a Swiss banker, and then you see him turn very quickly into that sort of righteous soldier mode that I discussed. He is tactical, he is ruthless, and he is single-minded in taking out his opposition. And I really love this pre-title sequence because I feel like it balances a lot of tones very well. We get a lot of big, explosive Bondian showmanship with Bond leaping out of the window and Bond being in the boat, straightening his tie underwater. It's very exuberant, even as it's starting to lean more into this sort of detective spycraft sort of narrative where Bond is put very much into an investigatory role throughout this story. In many ways, this movie is kind of Skyfall before there was Skyfall. It's a lot less dramatic about it, but again, this is a story about a figure from M's past who is seeking revenge for a perceived betrayal on M's part. M is very cagey about this, is trying to keep this backstory a bit of a secret. MI6 is attacked with a big explosion that forces the team to retreat to another location, and Bond is injured and is going through the process of his mission, bearing and working through this injury. It's very much the core skeleton and framework of Skyfall, just before Skyfall would do it on a much grander scale with Craig. I think it's very interesting to see the ways in which Brosnan's Bond is very different from Craig's Bond in the way that he overcomes sort of the trauma of injury, in the way that this movie treats that much more lightly. How Bond's solution to that problem is essentially to seduce his way into getting a clearance and is back off to the races. Bond's injury comes up, as a plot point in the movie, but it's not leaned into very much. Again, Pierce Brosnan's Bond is sort of both sensitive and vulnerable, but also very quick to rebound. A character who feels deeply in the moment, who experiences very fully the emotional experience of a moment, and then is able to move past it, recovers, and kind of moves on. He's never subject to this sort of ongoing history of trauma in the way that Craig's Bond will be. But again, this movie lets Brosnan really lean into his vulnerable side. And again, Brosnan's very good at letting Bond's inner monologue be exposed in the way he expresses dialogue, the way his face reveals the inner thought process. A very good example of that here is the scene where he and Elektra are together, and she asks him, "What do you do to survive?" And it's a just throwaway moment. I've never heard anybody talk about this moment before, but again, Brosnan just pauses, and you see that his Bond is thinking about that statement, coming up with a thoughtful response to it before he returns and says, "I take pleasure in great beauty." This sort of sense that this Bond is not just an impervious wall to those around him, but he's actually a human being relating to those around him. And that helps inform what is one aspect of this movie that I really like, is that the MI6 community really feels like an office in this movie, with interpersonal relationships. These really feel like coworkers occupying a business together, who have friendships and office resentments with one another. And Brosnan's Bond is the only Bond who really feels like, he could work in the midst of an office setting and have friends like Tanner and Robinson. That sort of relational history element of Brosnan's Bond, this sort of Bond who has friends in the world and seems like he credibly relates to other people, is very, very unique to Brosnan's Bond, and is one of the aspects I cherish. It adds a level of resonance to this being Q's last movie. Brosnan's Bond and Q have a sort of emotional attachment to one another that wouldn't have been the case with any other Bond and Bond. So, when Q bids farewell for what would be his final appearance in these movies, there's a nice level of sentiment behind it, in part because of who Brosnan's Bond is. Now, Bond and M's relationship is a big point in this movie, and this in some ways sets a framework for where the Craig movies would go in a much darker way. Dench's M is at her most vulnerable here. There's a feeling in this movie that both Bond and M are somewhat thrown off by the events of the opening of The World Is Not Enough. In this sort of attack on MI6, there's a hyper vulnerability that both of them are expressing, a sense that they are kind of reeling from this more intimate attack on their enclave. And M is obviously dealing with her own personal history here with Robert King and his daughter, and it's hinted that M had a romantic relationship with Robert at some time in the past, and there's sort of baggage from that. And Bond sort of takes that upon himself. So this is a movie where he's hyper vulnerable. One of the first things we see is him watching video footage of Elektra's, interrogation after she was recovered from her traumatic experience. And you see him almost like emotionally struggling to watch the video. He pauses it by touching Elektra's tear. That's a level of hypersensitivity that you really wouldn't get with any other Bond. And at the time, I'll admit, I've gone back and forth as to whether I appreciate this hypersensitivity for Brosnan's Bond in this film or whether I resent it. But having gone back and read some of the Fleming novels more, I appreciate this as a film that is really leaning into some of the very softer, more tender facets of the character that Ian Fleming's Bond established. I mean, Ian Fleming's Bond is the kind of character who talks in the novel Moonraker with Galibrand about how, flowers scream when they're plucked, and this sort of very hypersensitive, hyper-romantic, introspective Bond character shows up in the Fleming novels, especially in certain Fleming novels, and you see that facet of Fleming's Bond, and it's nice to see a film that leans into that facet in a strong way, because it's so underrepresented in the rest of the Bond film canon. So I really enjoy the villains at the heart of The World Is Not Enough. That is Renard and Elektra. This is a very melodramatic pair, and that emphasizes the overall sort of like brooding melodrama of the film on the whole. But it creates a nice triangle dynamic with Bond in the mix. So you have Elektra as the primary villain, and then you have sort of Renard and Bond as like mirrored oppositional forces rotating around the axis that is Elektra. And Elektra is very dramatic, very grand, very extra in a way that is instantly charismatic and appealing. I love Sophie Marceau's performance in this, and she's very big. And you see how both Bond and Renard can be pulled towards her in an almost destructive way. Renard is essentially on a course towards death, and he's happily stepping in that direction because of his obsessive desire for Elektra. And you see Bond kind of grappling with this, even as he's suspecting Elektra of being a villain. He's still not able to fully emotionally extricate himself from her charismatic allure. There's a very unusual scene in this movie for the Bond series where we see Elektra and Renard together. This is a very intimate scene between the two of them where they're essentially working through Renard's jealousy over Elektra having been with Bond. And we have not seen a couple of villains together in this sort of emotional entanglement before. And I enjoy the real oddness and sort of darkness of their relationship, especially as it's presented in that scene. It's very off-kilter, and it nicely feeds into the energy that we get in the very strong torture scene between Bond and Elektra, which again brings together this weird intimacy, this antagonism, this sort of uncomfortable space where she is clearly manipulating the men in her life, sees them as disposable, but these men are still nevertheless like caught in her orbit. That is a very interesting dynamic to me. She is she's forged in trauma a little bit, childhood trauma, a little bit like Alec Trevelyan, There is this sense of her wanting to atone for the sins of the past, both historically and on a personal level. And what I appreciate about her motivations, though, is it's not so on the nose. This is not like a direct revenge campaign against Britain. It's very charged with her own personal narrative, and she has this sort of aura of being like a dark, evil queen out of a fairy tale looking to restore her legacy and depose those around her. I don't know, there's a madness about it that is really compelling, especially when put against Pierce Brosnan's Bond. And Brosnan's Bond, I mean, Brosnan goes pretty hard in terms of like the melodramatic sort of soap opera acting against Marceau's Electra, but in some ways they're just balancing each other's energies. The one scene where he confronts her about Renard having known her key phrase and known about Bond's shoulder. The two of them are almost like competing to see who can be more dramatic. And I kind of enjoy that because it's a very plausible escalation in relationships. Sometimes relationship dynamics are just such that it brings out, the most dramatic and passionate sides of both people. And you kind of see that with Bond and Electra. It's not the case that Bond often encounters a woman as strong and emotionally charged as Electra King. And when he mourns her death in their final confrontation, he, and has killed her essentially in anger. Brosnan's Bond has this ability to go to places where he's like almost kind of like at a breaking point where he's barely holding it together. We saw this a lot in the scenes with Paris and Dr. Kaufman in Tomorrow Never Dies. Here it's turned up another notch, but he mourns Electra much as he does Paris and responds to it in much the same way. It's like a moment where he lets himself have a moment of full mourning, almost like grieves her corpse, and then puts that trauma behind him and is back to the mission. And that's the motive that we got in Tomorrow Never Dies. That's the motive. That's the, again, same pattern we see replicated here in The World Was Not Enough. That describes Pierce Brosnan's approach to emotional wounds in a nutshell, at least insofar as his Bond is concerned. Bond wounded very deeply in the moment, obviously very affected by it, but then, it's back to the mission. And I think that leaves us in a strong place for where Brosnan's Bond will go in Die Another Day, which is kind of like the mega arc of reestablishing the Bond character. But what I appreciate in how The World Is Not Enough allows this character to exist is Brosnan's Bond here is allowed to be intelligent. He's a detective figure. He's probing for characters' motivations. He's observing and making deductions in the moment. There's that nice scene at the casino where you see Bond having to put two and two together about how Zukovsky and Electra are actually making a deal at the table. That sort of deductive aspect is something that the series has generally lost as it's gone on. It has become more set piece driven. There's a lot less of this Bond the detective, and that's one thing that this movie really lets Bond do, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that this story is very much a Bond the detective sort of Bond story, because we don't get it that often. In Die Another Day, he's going to be back to full-on action hero mode in a lot of ways, and we will talk about that in the next video. So until then, let me know what you think about The World Is Not Enough. Let me know what you think about my thoughts here. Let me know how you feel about Brosnan's very emotive performance in this movie. It can be very divisive and has been for years. So I'll catch you in the next one.